A Texas task force begins the search for solutions after the shooting in El Paso.
We plowed a lot of ground, and we got off to what we consider to be a good start.
Texas lawmakers are shaping the debate.
This is happening on our watch, and this is our opportunity to make things right.
How the work from these meetings could shape new laws in Texas. The tragedy in El Paso has some people looking to Washington.
I do think that the American people want Congress to act. They want us to do something more.
One Texas congressman says he has a plan. Here his idea is to pump up background checks and to predict dangerous behavior. Hello, and thank you for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. Governor Abbott says closing gaps in background checks should be one part of how the state addresses gun violence. That's one idea that came out of the first meeting of the Texas Safety Commission, which the governor formed after the shooting in El Paso. Steffi Lee shows us other solutions they're targeting.
I think people need to see, and lawmakers need to see, the human tragedy. My student was not a Republican or a Democrat.
Dr. Juan Martinez's student was Javier Rodriguez. The 15-year-old was one of the 22 killed in the deadly attack in El Paso.
He can no longer run. He can no longer go play soccer. He can no longer graduate. His life is over. 15 years old. And that is beyond politics.
There are unique issues about what happened in El Paso that need to be addressed in addition to the type of violence that we saw in the aftermath of Santa Fe.
The Texas Safety Commission Thursday spent more than 2 hours in this room, drilling down on how to prevent gun violence.
There is sometimes a lag of the time period from when the person is convicted of a crime to when that information is reported to the time that it would get to whoever would be in charge of the background check.
They'll study the roots and growth of domestic terrorism and hate speech.
Free speech means there is some hateful, some disturbing things that are said over the internet. And unless it's a crime, we can't monitor it. And so that's why it's important that these companies have worked with us so they can identify things that really are precursors to violence.
And El Paso area lawmakers believe they can make a difference.
We've seen during parts of our state history and our country's history that we have tackled issues of racism or sexism through policy, and we institutionalize change. And so I am not giving up.
The Texas Safety Commission will hold its second meeting in El Paso on Thursday. The newly formed Domestic Terrorism Task Force will meet in Austin on Friday. At the Capitol, Steffi Lee. Josh, back to you.
Members of the legislature from El Paso will play a key role in the work of the Safety Commission. Joining us now is State Representative Cesar Blanco, a Democrat from El Paso. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
What are your takeaways, Representative? What do you hope comes out of these meetings?
Well, number one, I think we need to make sure that our community has the ability to heal from this tragic event that occurred in our community in El Paso. But I think, importantly, I think there's a discussion about how we're going to move forward in addressing hate crimes in our state, what the mediums are where a lot of these white supremacy groups and hate groups are operating. A lot of them are on the internet. And then, of course, taking a look at what we can do to making sure that we're implementing gun safety proposals so these type of tragedies don't continue to occur in mass.
Yeah, you've talked about the need for everyone to be mindful of the language they use moving forward. Why is that so important?
I think it's important about how we talk about immigrants, about how leaders of our country and our state talk about individuals that are in our communities. So I think it's important that we're careful, that there's sensitivity, especially in the aftermath of this horrible tragedy that was caused by a white supremacist who killed 22 people in our community. I think we need to begin to heal, not only in the state of Texas, but in our country.
You're talking about the rising threat of white nationalism. How can the commission and how can lawmakers respond to that threat specifically? What do you see as ideas?
Well, a couple of things that came to light as we worked with Twitter, Facebook, Google, and others is that there's definitely a need for content review, making sure that social media, once they identify hateful rhetoric, hateful sites, hateful platforms, making sure that they're shut down. Obviously, we want to make sure that the First Amendment is protected. However, when people are becoming radicalized in these sites, we want to make sure that there's mechanisms in place to making sure that they're shut down quickly so they don't continue to be radicalized and start mass shootings like they did in El Paso. So when we come back next week in El Paso for the second roundtable, I hope we get to talk more about the next steps ahead.
Yeah, how do you expect that one is going to be different from this one?
Well, the governor lined out exactly what I think our approach should be in El Paso, and I agree with him that it's about community healing and making sure that El Paso has all the state resources available to heal. That's from everything from mental health, from security, from bringing people together. And we're going to focus a lot about that. We're going to hear from experts in mental health. We're going to hear from faith leaders and a variety of folks. Our delegation is going to provide and has provided the governor with a list of individuals that we think would be suitable for this event. But more importantly, we need to hear from the victims and the families. We want to make sure that we're also hearing their stories, their concerns, their feelings about how we move forward from this tragedy. We also want to hear input from our first responders, whether they're law enforcement or healthcare first responders, what the best practices are, what they learned from this situation, and what steps we need to take forward as a state.
You released a statement shortly before the hearing saying that you feel like you owe it to the victims to make sure bold actions come from these committees. Talk to us about why this resonates so much with you personally.
It's personal because 22 people died. It's personal because it happened in our community. It's personal because I serve in the legislature with colleagues who have experienced mass shootings as we did here in El Paso. And it's important and relevant because we as elected officials have the opportunity to make something happen, to do something, to create change so that we're keeping our community safe. This is happening on our watch, and this is our opportunity to make things right.
Representative Blanco, thank you for joining us, and thank you for the work you're doing.
You bet. Thank you.
The search for solutions after El Paso has some people looking to Washington.
At the end of the day, we want to stop the actor from doing what they're getting ready to do.
We'll hear ideas one Texas congressman is pushing to stop future tragedies. New rules could keep migrant children held longer in detention facilities, while the federal head of citizenship and immigration says Congress can keep that from happening. This week, the Trump administration published new rules ending a long-time legal agreement about how long immigrant children can be held in custody. Many expect an injunction and a lawsuit to follow. One of those expecting legal action is a top Trump official. He spoke to our political reporter, Phil Prazen.
Ken Cuccinelli is the acting director of Citizenship and Immigration Services. He spoke to the conservative think tank, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Thursday morning about going back on the Flores Agreement. That's an agreement that only allowed the government to detain children with families for 20 days. Cuccinelli told me he did not know how many more people this would keep in detention.
That's going to unfold over time going forward, but like I said, there is space immediately now to use.
After a summer's worth of headlines describing cramped conditions and dangerous health hazards, he told me if Congress continues to fund the program, that won't happen again.
There's almost no children held past the 72-hour target any longer in these facilities, as the congressman said, that were not designed for this. So if they will take our advice on just the basics needed to handle the flow we're facing, I promise the same thing will happen at the adult level.
But some, like immigration attorney Griselda Ponce, are skeptical. The new rule will allow a child to be held until their immigration case is finished.
An asylum case generally goes for about 6 months to 9 months. If there's an appeal, it could go for an entire year to 2 years.
She's simply worried for the long-term health and well-being of her clients.
They can call it a residential facility, but when you go into these facilities, they're actually jail-like.
Ponce expects the California judge over the Flores Agreement to place an injunction over this latest change. Phil Prazen for State of Texas.
For more in-depth perspective on what's going on along the southern border, check out borderreport.com. It's a partnership with Nexstar stations from Brownsville to El Paso to San Diego. You'll find stories from across the region with perspective from those who live and work along the border. Texas lawmakers are teaming up in Washington to prevent future mass shootings.
I think anyone who purchases a firearm in this country should go through a background check. This is bottom line.
But they can't do it alone. Who they say needs to join the conversation about keeping us all safe. Welcome back to State of Texas. Earlier, we looked at what state leaders are doing in the wake of the deadly shootings in El Paso. One congressman from Texas has ideas for how the federal government should respond. Our Wes Rappaport spoke to Congressman Michael McCall about ideas to prevent future tragedies.
Thank you again for your time. Want to jump in and start about gun control. What do you see Congress doing with response to the shootings in El Paso, with response to the shooting in Dayton?
But I do think that the American people want Congress to act. They want us to do something more. So I am looking at several bills. One I plan to introduce with Senator Cornyn that would create, we have this National Center for Counterterrorism. And it's been set up after 9/11, but it really focuses on international terrorism, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. It doesn't look at domestic terrorism. We're evolving into an age of domestic terrorism. And when I talk to the FBI, they say sometimes now they're more concerned about domestic terrorism than international. I think when we crush the caliphate, so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria, the threat of international terrorism went down, but now we're seeing this rise in domestic terrorism shootings. The Senator Cornyn and I we're developing a bill that would create a center within the FBI that would work in a similar way to the National Center for Counterterrorism in the FBI to provide the intelligence fusion between federal, state, and local. But also a key point is to bring in the tech sector. And we're negotiating with the tech sector right now. When I was chairman of Homeland Security, we had Al-Qaeda, ISIS. I went to Twitter and Facebook, and I said, they're putting these messages on the internet to radicalize. It seems to me you have an obligation to identify, when it's a public chatter, identify that to authorities so we can take down these messages. And fortunately, they did. I think that we can do the same thing with domestic terrorism. There are warning signs along the way. This guy had a manifesto in El Paso. We saw a lot of warning signs with the Dayton shooter. And to have a predictive analytics, if you will, algorithms that can identify on public chatter, which is not protected by First Amendment, publicly, to identify that and then turn that over to law enforcement as a preventative measure. At the end of the day, we want to stop the actor from doing what they're getting ready to do. And it seems to me that what we did working with Twitter and Facebook on Al-Qaeda could also work with respect to domestic terrorism.
Real quick to follow up question there. So would you support a universal background check or red flag laws? Where do you land there?
Yeah, and we don't look at all those specific legislation, but I think certainly I think the red flag law is basically a grant program to let the states develop red flags. What I just talked to you about, predictive analytics, is kind of a red flag that would raise flags about a certain individual and then call it to the attention of law enforcement. So I think that's, I think anyone who purchases a firearm in this country should go through a background check. This is bottom line. Nobody should be able to buy a firearm. I used to prosecute federal firearm cases in Austin at the U.S. Attorney's Office here. And so, I've seen, the abuses. I've seen, these criminals that are carrying weapons. And on the federal side, the penalties are much stiffer than they are at the state side. So when I developed the Texas Exile program, it was to push more gun cases from the DA's office to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where they would get maximum punishment for possessing a firearm. I will say in about 80% of the cases I prosecuted, the firearm was stolen. It was not purchased legally. Now, having said that, the two firearms in these two, El Paso and Dayton, were purchased legally, so we have to look at that whole, and mental health. You can't disregard mental health. We have to have warning signs about mental health. And I think it's not just government that has a responsibility, it's the family that has a responsibility, it's a classmate in the school that has a responsibility, it's the teacher. If you see something, say something. If you see something online that doesn't look good, doesn't make sense, to report that. And all these cases, whether it be the Boston bombing to Austin bombing to El Paso to Dayton, there are always warning signs along the way that were never, they were picked up, but they were never reported. And then it could have been stopped. And that's what we need.
McCall represents Congressional District 10. The boundary stretched from Austin east into the suburbs of Houston. It's a district Democrats hope to flip in 2020. 3 Democrats are vying to challenge McCall, including Mike Siegel. He was the nominee in 2018. Siegel lost to McCall by 4 percentage points. 2 other candidates are running for the Democratic nomination. Shannon Hutchison is a lawyer. Pritesh Gandhi is a primary care physician. All of the District 10 candidates call Austin home. Congressman McCall used to lead the House Committee on Homeland Security. Next month, he'll share his expertise on the topic at the Texas Tribune Festival. It's one part of the 3-day event focused on Texas politics. Speakers include candidates, city leaders, and others who shape the policies that affect your life. We're one of the media partners for the Trib Fest, and it's happening on September 26th through the 28th in downtown Austin. Check out hashtag TribFest19 for more information.
We plowed a lot of ground, and we got off to what we consider to be a good start.
A Texas task force begins the search for solutions after the shooting in El Paso. But what comes next? We turn to our panel for perspective ahead on State of Texas.
In Texas, we believe in one thing. Make it 2 things: action and results.
Governor Abbott promises steps to prevent future tragedies after the shootings in El Paso. The first step, a roundtable meeting at the Capitol. For perspective on the big stories in Texas politics, we turn to our panel. Patrick Svitek is the primary political correspondent for the Texas Tribune, and we have our own politics reporter, Phil Prazen, joining us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So the governor and others have called this roundtable productive. I think everyone's wondering kind of what are the specifics that are going to happen, and one of those was a possible expanding of background checks that the governor talked about, but a lot of people are saying maybe that's not realistic in Texas. What do you think?
You know, it's been interesting, even in the wake of the shooting, the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, no moderate Republican by I think anyone's account, was talking about potentially expanding background checks, not going to what people would refer to as universal background checks, but maybe expanding them from where they currently are. And Abbott, at least after the roundtable, said that that was an issue that was discussed. He didn't seem to suggest there was a consensus on it, but he said that it was an issue that was discussed and that will continue to be discussed.
One of the talking points in the recent town hall we had with the governor, he rejected the idea of red flag laws again. But now in these roundtables, he's brought up the idea of welfare checks. Is that kind of the same thing?
It's not really the same thing. I mean, a red flag law would be a court, you know, friends and family going to a judge to remove guns from somebody because they think that they were going to commit a crime. Now, that's an actual process that we have similar processes already in place that they could just replicate and expand to this. The welfare check seemed to be more vague, you know, hey, I'm going to call the police just to see if you can come in and do a mental health check on this person. Nothing about taking guns away, just a checkup to say, hey, we're watching you, for lack of a better term.
The way that Abbott, the governor, discussed this issue after the roundtable, it struck me as him trying to find some compromise territory here. After he raised the issue of red flag laws after the Santa Fe High School shooting, and you know, he kind of put it on the table, and there was swift backlash from within some in his own party, and then he backed away from it. And so he's already felt some of the political heat that comes up around this issue. But at the same time, there are some Republicans, a lot of Democrats who do like this idea of red flag laws and do want him to go that path. And so it seems like on this issue, him bringing up this concept of having welfare checks instead said, which again is certainly not the same as a full-blown red flag law, is at least his effort to maybe find some middle ground here. But it's a political tightrope.
As talking about the politics of this, I mean, everybody, the context of this is that Texas is a more competitive state, Republican versus Democrat. And so this whole conversation is kind of new and interesting for all of us political watchers, because if Texas was still a primary, you know, Republican versus Republican state, and that is what determined the state leadership, we would never be having these conversations to begin with. So just now that there is competition from the Democrats, is forcing the state leaders to tack towards the middle on these issues, especially to appease suburban women who are really sick of their students and friends getting shot, going to Walmart, going in schools. I mean, the political stakes of this and the political stakes of doing nothing are really high for Republican leadership.
Yeah, Greg Abbott's not up for re-election next year. The Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick isn't. But a lot of state House members and members of Congress are up for re-election in suburban districts where these issues of safety and combating gun violence increasingly matter.
Patrick, Phil, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. We'll be back next week to bring you an in-depth look at Texas politics.